The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We welcome everybody to today's hearing on the FACE Act. It's a really important issue, and I now recognize myself for an opening statement. We want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. Some of you came a long way, and we really appreciate your time. Today is our committee's first hearing regarding the Biden administration's use of the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, or the FACE Act, as we call it. Since this Dobbs decision was leaked over a year ago now, there have been more than 100 attacks on pregnancy resource centers and churches across America, more than 100. And these attacks have included fire bombings and vandalism that includes phrases written in graffiti like, quote, "If abortions aren't safe, neither are you." It included smashing of windows, targeted online harassment, protesters threatening violence outside pregnancy resource centers and churches, and many other acts. Federal law obviously prohibits all of this conduct. The FACE Act states that, quote, "threats of force, obstruction, and property damage intended to interfere with pregnancy resource centers are illegal." It also states that force or threat of force to intentionally injure, intimidate, or interfere with any person lawfully exercising or seeking to exercise the First Amendment right of religious freedom at a place of religious worship is prohibited. However, here's the problem. The Biden administration has rarely enforced the statute to protect these organizations that are covered. For example, on June 7th, 2022, last summer, vandals associated with a group called Jane's Revenge firebombed the Compass Care Pregnancy Services in Buffalo, New York. $500,000 in damages were done to that facility. And to this moment, the FBI has done nothing to bring charges in the Compass Care case. That's just one example among many. The Justice Department to date has brought only 4 indictments against pro-abortion activists, all of which were related to a single Jane's Revenge attack in Florida. 4 indictments. Just 4 indictments are not even a drop in the bucket when you compare to the hundreds of attacks that have occurred against pro-life organizations and churches since this law's inception. But here's the worst part. And this is a glaring fact, and it's impossible to overlook. While these radical left-wing groups go unpunished, the Justice Department at the same time has unleashed federal law enforcement on pro-life advocates. Here's just a couple of examples. In October 2022, Eva Edel, an 87-year-old pro-life advocate and survivor of a communist concentration camp, was charged with a FACE Act violation for singing and praying near an abortion clinic. In February, Ms. Edel was again charged under the FACE Act for, quote, "standing in front of a door of a Michigan abortion clinic" in August 2020. Ms. Edel was confined to a wheelchair at that time, but the Justice Department claimed that the 87-year-old woman was charged because she, quote, "intimidated patients and employees." Then there's Mark Hauck, who we'll hear from shortly. He'll share his testimony today. His home was raided at dawn by more than 20 FBI agents with guns drawn in front of his wife and 7 young children for an alleged FACE Act violation. Thankfully, despite the FBI's brazen and unwarranted tactics, a 12-person jury unanimously and very quickly acquitted him of those federal charges that were brought against him. The targeting of advocates like Ms. Edel and Mr. Hauck, compared to the lack of enforcement against those who attack pregnancy resource centers and churches, is striking. Pregnancy resource centers serve millions of women annually across this country with a multitude of services virtually free of charge. Most of them are nonprofits, of course, and they should be able to operate without fear. They provide care to pregnant women and distribute necessary items like clothing and diapers to mothers. And the women that seek these services should be able to do so, obviously, without facing any danger. Churchgoers should be able to exercise their First Amendment right to religious freedom at places of worship without being terrorized. And unfortunately, this has not been the case under Attorney General Garland's Justice Department. This committee is concerned with the apparent unequal application of the FACE Act by the Biden administration. It is our job to monitor this. The application and enforcement of this act is an important matter of congressional oversight. And this hearing will provide members of our committee and our full committee and the judiciary with the opportunity to re-examine the FACE Act and explore ways that Congress might reform the statute. We believe in justice for all, and the FACE Act should be used to prosecute crimes committed against all entities covered by the law. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I yield back. I now recognize our ranking member, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing on revisiting the implications of the FACE Act, that is, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, gives us an opportunity to consider the deeply troubling, decades-long history of violence, threats, and intimidation of people providing or accessing reproductive health services. The FACE Act was passed in 1994 in response to a decades-long campaign of threats and violence by anti-abortion forces against facilities and providers of abortion services, and shortly after, a doctor who provided such services was murdered by these extremists in 1993. The bill had bipartisan support in both houses, passing by voice vote in the House and with bipartisan support in the Senate. In the past few years, we've seen a disturbing rise in political violence in this country, particularly from right-wing extremists. Just yesterday, we learned of an attempt to attack one of our House colleagues, which resulted in injuries and hospitalization for 2 of his staff members. This attack occurs amid a tenfold rise in threats of violence against members of Congress since 2016, but also a rise in threats and attacks against public officials, law enforcement, school board members, and other elected officials. Therefore, against the background of rising political violence, it might make sense to hold a hearing to examine how Congress can reduce political violence, particularly in the wake of the Dobbs decision, which overruled 50 years of precedent in Roe v. Wade. But that's not the purpose of this hearing. This majority has stacked the hearing with witnesses to testify about only threats and violence impacting anti-abortion facilities, while ignoring the far more numerous and ongoing threats against individuals and facilities that provide abortion care and other reproductive health services. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, since the start of this Congress, the extremist members of the House majority have sought to highlight only the reprehensible attacks against pro-life organizations and to suppress evidence of far greater and more long-standing attacks against abortion providers. This false equivalency and disinformation feeds into the division and chaos afflicting our country and encourages more violence. This hearing continues the narrative pushed by the House majority since the start of this Congress, a narrative of manufactured outrage to stigmatize and distract from the deeply unpopular efforts of an extremist minority to enact or enforce a nationwide abortion ban. One of the first bills passed by this Congress was H-Con Res 3, rammed through in the first week with no regular order, no process. That resolution condemned the recent attacks on pro-life facilities while conspicuously failing to condemn any of the thousands of acts of violence, threats, and intimidation faced by abortion providers and patients, whether in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision or over the course of preceding decades. Violence, threats, and intimidation tactics should have no place in our political discourse, including in our nation's ongoing debate over abortion access. We must condemn all political violence and threats of violence, whatever the beliefs or motivations of those who engage in it, and regardless of who the target may be. Experts on political violence and the threat it poses to our democracy say that one of the primary things that must happen is leaders must condemn such political violence. And just as pernicious as normalizing or advocating for such violence is those who twist the facts to excuse or minimize such violence when it supports their cause. So, yes, the FACE Act scope does include anti-abortion facilities, but let's be clear, the overwhelming majority of such violence, threats, and intimidation has been and continues to be directed against abortion providers and patients by anti-abortion extremists. So any attempt to revisit the implications of the FACE Act have to consider that history and the ongoing facts of such violence. Now, we've just heard that the Republican majority is trying to show that there's some kind of selective enforcement by the Biden administration in enforcing the FACE Act to target anti-abortion activists. But I think the facts speak for themselves. FBI Director Wray testified to the Senate last summer that when it was reported the Supreme Court intended to reverse Roe v. Wade, the FBI put out a directive to its field offices to be actively looking for potential threats. He said that the Joint Terrorism Task Forces were specifically focused on attacks and threats against churches, pro-life organizations, pregnancy resources centers, and similar organizations. Ray went on to say there's too many people that seem to think that passions running high justifies engaging in violence and destruction of property. Sorry, I had an extended quote. I don't think we need to go into all of it, but he says, on abortion or anything else, you don't get to use violence or threats of violence to act on it, and we're going to go after that conduct aggressively. I feel very strongly about that. I've communicated that very strongly to all of our field offices and our workforce. And in fact, earlier this year, the Department of Justice successfully obtained indictments in the Middle District of Florida against 2 people for violating the FACE Act after they allegedly vandalized an anti-abortion crisis pregnancy center. The department has also reached out to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, among other groups, to ask for their assistance to let the anti-abortion facilities know that the FACE Act protects them. And further, in December of last year, the FBI offered a $25,000 reward to obtain evidence concerning attacks against such facilities. So my colleagues on the other side of the aisle continue to push a false narrative that the federal government is out to get them, but the facts are not on their side. The clear majority of Americans believe we must protect access to abortion and the freedom to make such healthcare decisions in consultation with one's doctor, not politicians. At this point, I would seek unanimous consent to introduce a report from the National Abortion Foundation entitled 2022 Violence and Disruption Statistics.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the chairman of our full Judiciary Committee, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Politics is driving the agenda in our federal agencies. If you don't believe me, just read the Durham report from yesterday. No probable cause, no predicate, no evidence whatsoever, and yet they used a fake dossier from the Clinton campaign to open an investigation into a presidential campaign. And they spied on American citizens. Here's what the Durham report said. Quote, the FBI failed to uphold their mission of fidelity to the law. They didn't follow the law. In 2020, we've just learned in the last couple of weeks, it was the Biden campaign working with 51 former intelligence officials to put together a letter that was not accurate to interfere with a presidential election. Politics is driving the agenda in far too many agencies in our government, and today it's not limited to presidential campaigns. Today they come after American citizens. You could be a Catholic attending a mass. You could be a parent showing up at a school board meeting, or you could be like Mr. Hauck, a pro-lifer praying at a clinic, and you will be targeted. You could be targeted by our government. That is how scary the situation has become. So I want to thank Mr. Hauck and the other witnesses for being here today. God bless you, Mr. Hauck, what you had to go through. 20 agents showing up at your house in front of your wife, your 7 children, arresting you when you were willing to turn yourself in. That is how ridiculous it has become in our country. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for this hearing. We are sick of the double standard. We are sick of politics driving who gets prosecuted, who gets pursued, and who doesn't. It is wrong. It's not supposed to happen in the greatest nation ever, where we have a Bill of Rights, where we have a Constitution, where we have the rule of law. But it is. And this hearing is going to help expose all the ridiculous things going on, and why, frankly, this Congress should look at the appropriations process and what we have to do there to begin to rein in these federal agencies that are trampling on American citizens' rights. With that, I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I should be astonished, but I'm not, that the chairman of the committee would quote from the discredited Durham report and the discredited Mr. Durham, who filed, I think, a 300
Gentlemen,
and something,
you?
no, who filed a something 300-page report giving his opinions, but whose 2 prosecutions both resulted in acquittals and jurors saying, why did we ever even have to take this? Mr. Chairman, I'd like to begin by saying that I condemn violence in all its forms, including threats, vandalism, and property destruction against any person or organization, regardless of their position on abortion rights. I would also like to reiterate my condemnation of the attempted murder of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. I'm grateful that law enforcement took Justice Kavanaugh's would-be assassin into custody before he could complete an act of violence. In a democracy, violence is never the answer in a political dispute, and it should be roundly and unreservedly condemned. Yet for decades, anti-abortion extremists have used violence, threats, and disruption to curb access to abortion. According to the National Abortion Federation, or NAF, since 1977, anti-abortion extremists have been responsible for 11 murders, 42 bombings, 200 arsons, 531 assaults, and thousands of incidents of criminal activities directed at patients, providers, and volunteers. Nearly 30 years ago, in response to this disruptive violence, including the murder of Dr. David Gunn, Congress passed the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. I've been unequivocal in my support for the FACE Act, as well as for the First Amendment rights of anti-abortion protesters, with whom I deeply disagree, so long as that speech does not cross the line into violent conduct or disruption. As a co-sponsor of the bill in 1993, which our former Judiciary Committee colleague and now Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer introduced in the House, I remarked on the floor that, quote, anti-abortion protesters have an absolute right to say don't do it, or anything else they want to say. They do not have any right to say, by means of physical force or intimidation, we won't let you do it, close quote. Today's subcommittee hearing, however, is a lost opportunity to focus on the real, long-standing problem of violence and disruption that doctors, nurses, patients, and volunteers face in providing or accessing abortion, which appear to have spiked following the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs. Instead, the apparent purpose of today's hearing is to provide yet another platform for the majority's inflammatory, anti-federal law enforcement rhetoric, which I fear will only further contribute to a political climate where anti-abortion extremists believe their violent conduct is justified, particularly in states where abortion remains protected by law. According to NAF's latest report on the matter, in 2022, states that are protective of abortion rights saw a disproportionate increase in violence and disruption targeting doctors and their patients. This includes a 538% increase in obstructions, which NAF defines as causing a delay or attempting to cause a delay in the conduct of business, or preventing people from entering or exiting an area, textbook examples of the conduct prohibited by the FACE Act. Despite this surge in incidents and the long history of violence and disruption perpetrated by anti-abortion extremists, which necessitated Congress to pass the FACE Act in the first place, today's hearing is designed to further the majority's misleading political narrative that the Biden administration is using federal law enforcement to target conservatives. There is zero evidence that federal prosecutors are selectively targeting anti-abortion protesters under the FACE Act. To the contrary, it appears that DOJ is enforcing the law without regard to defendants' viewpoints. At a recent bipartisan briefing provided to Judiciary Committee staff, FBI representatives stated that approximately 75% of FACE Act investigations concern incidents against anti-abortion facilities. Yet Republicans insist on devoting the subcommittee's time to this manufactured controversy to placate a minority of anti-abortion MAGA Republicans who would like this Congress to pass a total nationwide ban on abortion. Let me be clear. Democrats stand with the majority of the American public and will always oppose such a radical position. But regardless of your position on abortion rights, we must condemn all acts of violence, regardless of who is the ultimate target, and make clear that any individual who violates the FACE Act should be subject to prosecution. Unfortunately, by refusing to acknowledge the problem of violence against providers and patients and focusing only on this false narrative of malevolent federal law enforcement, today's hearing will inadvertently send the wrong message to anti-abortion extremists at a critical moment in our nation where reproductive freedom and abortion access is in crisis. This hearing is, in a sense, a repeat of a resolution we passed the first week of this session, the first week of Republicans' control of the House, when we passed the resolution condemning violence at anti-abortion facilities, pregnancy crisis centers, but rejected a Democratic amendment to add a condemnation of violence at abortion providers also. So they rejected an amendment. They said will condemn violence against anti-abortion clinics, but we will not condemn, maybe say okay too, could not condemn violence at abortion clinics. Mr. Chairman, I believe today's hearing is a wasteful and ultimately irresponsible use of this subcommittee's time. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record in response to Mr. Nadler's, quote, manufactured crisis, the list of over 100 crisis pregnancy centers and churches that have been vandalized in the aftermath of the leak of the Dobbs opinion and the Dobbs decision.
Without objection, and I will also offer into the record, seeking unanimous consent to include the Family Research Council report and its supplemental report. It's entitled, Hostility Against Churches is on the Rise in the United States, Analyzing Incidents from 2018 to 2022. It's prepared by Ms. Ariel Del Turco, who's going to testify here shortly. And just one headline, key point, at least 420 acts of hostility against churches occurred between January 18, September 2022, across 45 U.S. states and Washington, D.C. Without objection, these will all be entered into the record. And without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record as well. And we now introduce today's witnesses. We'll begin with Mr. Mark Hauck. He's a father, husband, and pro-life advocate. In October 2021, he was standing on a street corner praying outside a Planned Parenthood facility. And after Mr. Hauck and his 12-year-old son were approached and harassed by a Planned Parenthood escort, Mr. Hauck pushed the escort away from his young son. Nearly a year later, he was charged with violations of the FACE Act, and despite his lawyer offering to have him turn himself in, Mr. Hauck's home was raided in the early morning by approximately 20 FBI agents and other law enforcement officers. Mr. Hauck was unanimously acquitted of the charges by a jury. Ms. Tammy Kocher is the executive director of New Life Family Services in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. In March 2023, one of her facilities had its windows broken and its building was defaced by this group, Jane's Revenge, and their graffiti. And one of those messages read, "If abortions aren't safe, neither are you." Ms. Talcott Camp is with us. She's Chief Legal and Strategy Officer at the National Abortion Federation. She oversees NAF's legal work and plays a major role in all NAF's strategic decision-making. Prior to joining the Federation, she was the Deputy Director of the ACLU's Reproductive Freedom Project. Mr. Jeremy Dice is a Senior Counsel at First Liberty Institute. First Liberty is the nation's largest legal organization dedicated exclusively to defending religious liberty for all Americans. In his role, Mr. Dice litigates on behalf of clients in state and federal courts, including FACE Act cases. Ms. Ariel Del Turco, referenced earlier, is the Director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council, where she's responsible for religious freedom policy and advocacy efforts. And her recent research includes tracking the number of attacks against churches across the country. We just entered that report in the record. We welcome our witnesses, and we thank you all again for appearing today. We'll begin by swearing you in, so would you please rise and raise your right hand for us? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Thank you, and let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You can be seated. So all of you know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety, but we ask you to summarize that testimony in your 5 minutes that's allotted. You have a microphone in front of you. It has a clock and a series of lights. When the light turns yellow, you should begin to conclude your remarks, and when the light turns red, that means your time has expired. So, Mr. Hauck, we'll begin with you, and you can start now. Hit that button for us. There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, Madam Ranking Member, and Jim Jordan, thank you for inviting me to be here today, and all committee members, thank you. 20 years ago, I began pro-life work in the city of Philadelphia. I did peaceful protests and prayer vigils in front of many abortuary facilities in Philadelphia. They have always been peaceful. I want to bring you to October 13th, 2021, where I was with my son, 12-year-old son, praying in front of an abortuary in Philadelphia. On that day, a couple women walked out of the facility. I began to offer them literature, as I always do, with compassion, love, and great respect. In fact, I was 50 feet away from the entrance of the building. I proceeded to walk with those women across the street making me about 100 feet away from the entrance to the building, to a crisis pregnancy center, pregnancy resource center, which is about 6 feet away from me. At that time, an escort in the building decided to run over, impede my progress, and get in the way of me ministering and talking to the women that had left Planned Parenthood, 12th and Locust Streets in Philadelphia. At that point, we exchanged some words. We went back to where we were praying, and I continued to pray with my 12-year-old son. About 20 minutes later, the escort, his name is Bruce Love, I've known him for years, I've known him for 20 years, came out of the building. He made a direct line towards my son, stood right next to my son. Again, we're about 50 feet from the entrance to the building. Stood right next to my 12-year-old boy who was a little intimidated and scared by this. I asked him if he could please give him some space. He did not. He has a right to be there. We just continued to pray. He continued to talk to me and offer insults to me, which of course he's done before, and it was never a problem for me, and I didn't listen to it. But then he started to begin to talk to my son. Now, he's talked to my son before. In fact, I believe he taught my son the F word. I'm a homeschool dad, and that's the reality of it. Nonetheless, he begins to talk to my son and badger my son, and starts telling my son how evil his father is and how his father doesn't want to help women. I instructed him to step away and to go back to where he normally stands in front of the building, which he did not. He continued to badger my son. After repeated requests not to comply, not to stand next to my son, I escorted him back to where he normally stands, which he did comply. I turned around to face my son and go back to pray, and he turned around and began to badger my son again. At that point, I became a dad on the street, concerned for my son. I did push the man. He did fall down. We went, we prayed for the man, we returned to the scene. I presented my information to the Civil Affairs Department. That day, I gave my information. I want you to know that the Philadelphia PD and the DA in Philadelphia, as well as the Civil Affairs Department, did not intend to prosecute. They had no interest in that. I was put in a private criminal complaint, which was dismissed. I want to take you to April 22nd when it was dismissed. 5 days later, this is 2022, I was served a target letter on the same street corner with my 12-year-old boy. A target letter that I was a target of a federal indictment. Fast forward to September 23rd. My attorneys reached out and initially at the target letter stating that we would peacefully present ourselves to the district. There would be no need to come out to his house and disrupt his family and cause any trauma to them. That he's a peaceful man, he will come in. We said that. In August of 2022, my attorney reached out to me and says, "Have you heard from the assistant U.S. attorney?" I said, "No." "She won't return my phone calls," he says. I said, "Well, maybe we'll just let sleeping dogs lie." On September 23rd, my home was raided by 10 unmarked and marked units, state troopers, federal law enforcement personnel. I had 5 federal agents on my doorstep at 6:30 in the morning with long guns pointed at me and my 7 children. They banged on the door and they said, "Open up." They did not even declare who they were that day. They didn't even ask me, "Could you please open the door with the FBI?" They just said, "Open up." I went to the door, I was up. I said, "Who is it?" They said, "It's the FBI, open up." So I opened up the door peacefully. I said, "Please stay calm. I have 7 babies in here." They pointed M16 guns at me and my wife. My wife comes down and says, "Do you have a warrant for his arrest?" They said, "We're taking him with or without a warrant." My wife said, "You can't do that. That's kidnapping." We proceeded to go into a 4.5-month trial that, as you know and have said previously, that we were acquitted of. But I was facing 11 years in prison, and I had every prospect in my heart that I would be in federal prison away from my 7 children. Thankfully, we were able to be acquitted, and I'm blessed to be able to share the story today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hauck. Ms. Kocher, you're next. You may begin.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Scanlon, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to join today. My name is Tammy Kocher, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of New Life Family Services in Minneapolis, Minnesota. For 50 years, New Life has served Minnesota families as one of the most comprehensive, faith-based nonprofit organizations of its kind through its 5 pregnancy centers in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, as well as Rochester. We provide professional, life-affirming care through no-cost pregnancy, parenting, and post-abortion services, as well as licensed adoption services. Every year, we serve more than 6,000 women, men, and children through our 5 centers. We are particularly proud of our newest center, a 12,600 square foot building in the heart of urban Minneapolis. This facility houses our largest pregnancy center and a full-service nonprofit medical clinic started by African immigrants. It has been a decade-long vision that came to fruition in 2022. Our new building is located in the Phillips community of Minneapolis, which is one of the most beautifully diverse and resilient communities in our state. It is also a community filled with numerous challenges, including generational poverty, illegal drugs, and gang activity. As you may recall, in 2020, Minneapolis was literally on fire after the tragic death of George Floyd. Our new center is about 1 mile north of George Floyd Square. This community has endured so much over the past several years, and while Minneapolis has struggled greatly since 2020, New Life's love and commitment to this city and to hard-hit communities in particular has never wavered. My purpose today is to share about the increasing hostility that pregnancy centers like ours are facing across the country. There are more than 3,000 pregnancy centers in the U.S. that provide compassionate, quality, no-cost medical and social services to hundreds of thousands of women, children, and families every year. In New Life's 50-year history, we have never experienced the type of attacks as we have this past year. Since the Dobbs decision, there have been numerous false narratives and outright lies told about the work of pregnancy centers. Minnesota is sadly one of the many states that have quickly turned into a hostile environment for pro-women, life-affirming organizations like ours. On August 23rd of last year, Minnesota Attorney General Ellison issued a misleading consumer alert warning Minnesotans about pregnancy centers like ours, using the same false narratives perpetuated by abortion activists. Words are powerful, especially when spoken by people in position of authority, and when those in authority regurgitate these false narratives, it can have devastating consequences for organizations like ours, and it has. The day after Attorney General Ellison released his consumer alert, we had threatening posters plastered all over the community surrounding our new clinic. You can see Exhibit B in my written testimony. We were warned if abortions aren't safe, neither are you. A few months later, there was a protest outside our center near the University of Minnesota. And then on March 4th of this year, a little after 2 a.m., we were notified by law enforcement that our brand new building in Minneapolis was badly vandalized. We had multiple windows smashed in. The front of our building was covered with threatening graffiti messages. Again, we were warned if abortions aren't safe, then neither are you. Other graffiti stated, "Jane was here, F12, etc." The vandals caused more than $30,000 worth of damage in a matter of 2 minutes. To add insult to injury, there was a protest planned for later that day at the park across the street. The protesters, however, couldn't resist the backdrop of our damaged building. So while we were literally in the midst of boarding up our broken windows, they moved their protest right in front of our center. We are the 5th organization in Minnesota that has been vandalized in these coordinated attacks. Many more pro-life centers across the country have endured the same threats and violence under the banner of Jane's Revenge. While these attacks are meant to intimidate and hurt us, the people who are ultimately hurt are our clients, single moms, families who are struggling to make ends meet, and young women who are being pressured into an abortion. They are the real victims here. The truth is, not every woman facing an unplanned pregnancy wants an abortion. Many of the women we serve want to continue their pregnancy, but lack the support and practical resources needed to do so. Without pregnancy centers and the important work that we do every day, the 3 million women who experience an unintended pregnancy each year will be left with fewer options and fewer resources. Whatever you believe about abortion, we should agree that nonprofit organizations like ours that contribute millions of dollars in free services to women, children, and families in their communities should not be the targets of vandalism and terrorism. The people we serve should not feel threatened simply for walking through our doors. When pregnancy centers aren't safe, our patients aren't safe. Thank you for the opportunity to share about the important work of pregnancy centers like ours and the increasing hostility that we are enduring.
Thank you, Ms. Kocher, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name earlier.
That's okay.
Sorry for the chaos in the hallway, too. You performed like a pro there. Let's see, Ms. Camp, you're next, and you may begin.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Scanlon, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Talcott Camp, and I'm the Chief Legal and Strategy Officer of the National Abortion Federation, or NAF. I have worked to support providers of abortion care for decades, both in my previous role at the ACLU and my current role at NAF. NAF is the Professional Association of Abortion Providers, with a mission to unite, represent, serve, and support abortion providers in delivering patient-centered, evidence-based care. Since 1977, NAF has compiled an invaluable database of statistics on anti-abortion extremist violence, allowing us to track patterns and trends. Last week, we released our 2022 violence and disruption statistics, a copy of which is attached to my written testimony, which I believe Ranking Member Scanlon has moved into the record. Since 1977, there have been 11 murders, 26 attempted murders, 42 bombings, 200 arsons, 531 assaults, 492 clinic invasions, 375 burglaries, and thousands of other criminal incidents targeting abortion patients, providers, and volunteers. Each of these incidents involves a real person with a real family and often real children, and every one of these incidents means that every provider of abortion care and every patient trying to access abortion care lives in terror. NAF's 2022 statistics show increases in major incidents. Comparing 2022 with 2021, the number of death threats or threats of harm rose from 182 to 218. Stalkings rose 229% from 28 to 92. Burglaries rose 231%, and 4 clinic arsons occurred in 2022 alone. The statistics also show a sharp increase in violence and disruption in very specific states. The Supreme Court decision overturning Roe and the subsequent proliferation of state abortion bans emboldened anti-abortion extremists to travel specifically to states where abortion remains legal, to target clinics, clinicians, and patients there. We must stand against violence at clinics providing abortion care in states where it remains legal and recognize that a national ban on abortion would be an even greater public health catastrophe. No one should fear violence in the workplace or when seeking health care. Yet abortion providers, patients, and volunteers face violence and harassment every day. Here's a couple examples from 2022. In that year, we saw a 100% increase in arsons compared to 2021. One of those arsons was at a clinic set to open in Casper, Wyoming in June 2022. But in May, shortly after reporting on the Supreme Court's expected decision in Dobbs, an arsonist broke into the clinic and set it on fire. The arson devastated staff, delayed the clinic's opening by nearly a year, and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in repairs. A few months earlier, an anti-abortion extremist stood outside a NAF member clinic on the East Coast with a flaming torch, holding a photo of one of the clinic's abortion providers, including his full name, personal information, and the word "wanted" printed on it. Through a megaphone, they shouted details about his family, his wife's name, how many children he had. They then posted a video of these threats on a public social media page, ensuring that their menacing message reached a wide audience. The use of that "wanted" poster was not singular or new. That extremist tactic harkens back to the terrifying circumstances surrounding Congress's enactment of the FACE Act, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, in 1994 with bipartisan support. For many years, anti-abortion extremists had used clinic blockades to intimidate and prevent access to clinics. The first clinic arson was in 1976, followed by a series of bombings in 1978, and the attacks and threats escalated. In the 1990s, extremists began using butyric acid attacks and anthrax threat letters. In 1993, Dr. David Gunn was murdered outside his clinic, the first abortion provider killed by anti-abortion extremists. He, too, was featured on a wanted-style poster before his murder, as were other now-slain abortion providers. Since Dr. Gunn's murder, there have been 10 more murders and 26 attempted murders, most recently in Colorado Springs in 2015. It was in response to this escalating violence that Congress passed the bipartisan FACE Act, which has been an important tool in addressing extremist violence over the last 3 decades. Every administration has enforced the FACE Act, Republican and Democratic alike. Nonetheless, abortion providers and their patients face unrelenting threats of violence and disruption to care. I'm here today because no one should fear violence at their workplace or when they're trying to access health care. For decades, abortion providers and their patients have faced escalating harassment and violence. In the post-Dobbs world, that atmosphere has only intensified, making FACE and the protections it offers all the more critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Camp. Mr. Dice, you may begin now.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Scanlon, and members of the committee. I'm Jeremy Dice, and I serve as Senior Counsel for First Liberty Institute, a nationwide legal organization dedicated to defending religious liberty for all Americans. Thank you for your very kind invitation to testify here this morning. The Freedom to Access to Clinic Entrances Act promises to ensure access to the nation's reproductive health facilities and accountability to those who would unlawfully restrict access to those facilities. The law is quite clear. If you attempt to injure, intimidate, or interfere with access to a reproductive health facility, then you may face both criminal charges and civil penalties. The FACE Act is intentionally broad in its scope, affording protection to facilities that provide services, quote, relating to the human reproductive system, unquote. Pam Hibbard provides reproductive counseling every day to women at her facility. She also lives there. One morning, she woke to find shattered glass strewn about the ground. Her facility had red paint dripping down the outside walls as if it were blood. On the sidewalks, clients seeking access to reproductive services would have to walk over spray-painted threats. Pam did not know if she was safe, nor if her clients would be safe. Not far away, Jill Jurgensen woke to a similar scene at her reproductive health facility. Vandals had shattered the glass of the front door of her facility. Clients would soon arrive to find spray-painted threats on the threshold. These scenes played out across the country more than 100 different times following the decision of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization just last year. Yet despite these numerous attacks to life-affirming reproductive health facilities, the Department of Justice has indicted just 4 individuals under the FACE Act in the past year. More concerning is the response of state attorneys general. The FACE Act explicitly authorizes state attorneys general to seek civil penalties on behalf of the citizens of each state against those who engage in such unlawful acts of intimidation. Yet in Massachusetts, rather than deploy the FACE Act in defense of Pam and Jill's facilities, former Attorney General Maura Healey threatened them with sanctions. Then the Massachusetts Attorney General issued a consumer advisory against the very centers who suffered broken windows, paint bombs, and spray-painted threats from Jane's Revenge. Florida tells a very different story. Martha Avila showed up to her reproductive health facility in Hialeah, Florida on July 4th of 2022, only to discover a threat from Jane's Revenge. If abortion is not safe, neither are you. Her experience, though, is different from Pam or Jill's. Once Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody knew the name of the vandals who allegedly attacked Martha's facility, she filed a lawsuit under the FACE Act to impose the maximum civil penalties against them. The FACE Act is, and ought to be, indifferent to ideology. It is meant to hold accountable those who use violence to express disagreement. Its application should not be withheld because a government official disagrees with the facility's religious beliefs. In Florida, the DOJ investigated and indicted the alleged vandals under the FACE Act. That allowed the Florida Attorney General to file her suit on behalf of the state, and it also allowed First Liberty to defend Martha and Heartbeat of Miami in a private legal action under the FACE Act. Had the DOJ and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts similarly identified potential FACE Act defendants, our clients there, and perhaps elsewhere, may have had recourse under the FACE Act as well. Violence is never an appropriate response to disagreement, and those who would so express their disagreement with life-affirming reproductive health facilities must be held accountable under the law. Applying the FACE Act equitably simply ensures that our nation will not tolerate violence as a means to political ends. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify here this morning. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dice. And Ms. Del Turco, you may begin.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Scanlon, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Ariel Del Turco, and I'm the director of the Center for Religious Liberty at Family Research Council. Our organization desires all people to have the freedom to exercise their faith. This freedom is significantly undermined whenever houses of worship are the targets of violent or destructive acts. It would be appropriate at this time to note that the FACE Act specifically includes protections for places of religious worship. It protects the faithful exercising their right of religious freedom in these places, while also protecting such places from efforts to damage or destroy their property. In December 2022, FRC released a report analyzing publicly documented acts of hostility against churches over the past 5 years. We identified 420 incidents that occurred in 45 states and Washington, D.C. between January 2018 and September 2022. We noted a recognizable increase in frequency over the course of that reporting period. These acts include vandalism, arson, bomb threats, gun-related incidents, and interruption of worship services. All of these are punishable under the FACE Act. FRC updated our report in April and found an additional 54 incidents in the final months of 2022 and 69 in the first quarter of 2023. If the trend continues, this year will be on track to have the highest number of church attacks over the last 6 years. All told, FRC has observed 565 attacks against churches from January 2018 to April 2023. I would now like to highlight a few examples for you. In February 2023, vandals broke into the Delabrook Presbyterian Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. They sprayed a fire extinguisher all over the church and into the ventilation system, causing $40,000 in damage. One church staff member told a local news station, "I keep wondering why. It shows a great deal of anger. Are they angry at us? Were they angry at churches? Were they angry at God?" In these attacks, many churches are defaced with obscene or hateful messages. In October 2021, vandals spray-painted anti-Catholic messages on the front of Denver's Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception, including the words, "Satan lives here." In March and April of 2019, 3 historically Black Baptist churches in or near Port Barre, Louisiana, were set on fire by the same individual within a 10-day span. Following the leak of the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision last May, at least 57 acts of hostility against churches were directly related to abortion. On June 25th, the day after the Dobbs announcement, St. Patrick Catholic Church in Philadelphia was spray-painted outside with the phrase, "Abort the church." On June 26th, pro-abortion protesters interrupted Mass at St. Joseph Catholic Church in Chicago and began chanting slogans and distributing leaflets. At least one protester held up a sign that read, "The Catholic Church has blood on its hands." Not only Christian churches are subjected to such attacks. The Anti-Defamation League reported hundreds of anti-Semitic incidents against Jewish institutions in 2022, including synagogues and Jewish schools. The American Civil Liberties Union has tracked nearly 400 anti-mosque incidents since 2005. Violent attacks against places of worship are completely unacceptable, and it should concern those of all faiths and political persuasions. As long as the FACE Act is on the books, it should be used to go after perpetrators of attacks on places of worship. Anti-religious hostility has no place in our society or any country that wants to call itself a land of freedom. This issue deserves the full attention of the American public and the full weight of law enforcement. We appreciate the subcommittee's interest in learning about attacks on places of religious worship as it considers the effectiveness and application of the FACE Act. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Del Turco. And we will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions, and I recognize myself first for 5 minutes. Look, I said in the opening, and I'll reiterate here again as we begin the questioning period, that we believe that the facts show that the Biden administration has shown a clear double standard of enforcing the FACE Act in a way that protects pro-abortion activists and facilities while substantially ignoring attacks on pro-life advocates, facilities, and churches. And it is a disgrace that the Justice Department would rather cater to the pro-abortion political movement than protect places that assist pregnant women in need. I'm gonna start just with a brief question of Mr. Dice. From your observation and firsthand experience in litigating these matters, do you agree with our assessment that the current Department of Justice is engaged in selective enforcement of federal law based purely on political motivation?
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. You know, Congress passed the Freedom to Access Clinic Entrances Act to uphold the rule of law in this country. And after a year in which we have seen over 100 different instances of attacks upon life-affirming reproductive health facilities, and as Ms. Del Turco just testified about, even more against houses of worship, it's incumbent upon our leadership to ensure that the full weight of the federal government and the law is being applied. I think the American people would have no less expectation of this committee than to insist that its laws be applied equitably and across the board. And the problem that we have, if I may just wrap up, I'm sorry, is that in order to prosecute these claims, the most difficult part of the entire process for us as lawyers is to have a name of someone to prosecute. And that starts with General Garland. If his DOJ is able to provide to us a name after an investigation, we are happy to utilize the laws that you have passed to defend these reproductive health facilities from the noxious attacks that they've had to withstand over the past year.
Very good. Ms. Del Turco, thank you for researching and reporting on the rise of attacks against churches that we've seen in recent years. It's especially concerning that in the first 3 months of this year, there were approximately 3 times as many attacks on churches as in the same time frame in 2022. And sadly, although many of these acts of violence could be charged under the FACE Act, they have gone unprosecuted. So what do you think is spurring this increased violence against churches in America?
Well, I think there are a lot of factors. We certainly see increasing secularism in the United States, increasing lack of respect for religion, understanding for religion or religious traditions. But in addition, I think it's motivated as well by these political battles that tend to fall along religious lines. When you see Catholic churches being blamed for the Dobbs decision and attacked, that's clearly a problem, right? It's very much a problem when in our political system for democracy, when one side loses a political battle and they go and attack churches. This is a horrendous problem.
Yeah, I'm going to ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record this letter that First Liberty, a correspondence with Senator Warren, and in it is some photographs of some of these abuses. This is Jane's Revenge and other groups, and you know they graffiti on the side of churches, abort the church, and if abortions aren't safe, neither are you, Jane's Revenge, all over the place. Then they go to the pregnancy care centers and they vandalize them. And again, you know, nothing's being done about this. I think every person watching this hearing should recognize that, you know, you could be next. Right now it's churches and pro-life groups and people being targeted that are pro-life, but that doesn't mean that other Americans wouldn't be targeted tomorrow. And it's a disturbing reality that the federal government has gotten too big, too powerful, and it's improperly wielding that power against the American people to appease a political base. The Durham report, as Mr. Jordan noted earlier, makes clear the FBI, for example, the FBI in the Durham report, quote, failed to uphold their important mission of strict fidelity to the law. My friends, that is a serious problem in a constitutional republic, and it's one that we aim to fix, and we'll be about that. I got less than a minute, but I wanted to turn to Mr. Hauck real quick about, you know, speaking of disparate treatment, your story is so compelling, and what the FBI did there to arrest you is astounding. Isn't it true that once you learned, to get this clear for the record, once you learned that law enforcement was interested in questioning you, you offered to appear voluntarily, right?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. Yes, that's correct.
And so they did this big raid with 20 agents with long guns pointed at you and your 7 young children and your wife, even though you offered to go in without issue. That's correct.
That's correct.
And it was about a year after the event actually took place, right?
That's right.
It seemed to correspond, in our view, with the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, and it was released there. It sent the pro-abortion allies into a frenzy. Do you have an opinion on the timing of why they came to your house and raided you that way?
Sure. Well, real quick, my indictment target letter was preceded the Dobbs leak, and then of course the Dobbs leak was early May, and then of course the Dobbs in June, and then we saw a series of arrests. And then, of course, I was not expecting that myself because my attorney said that we would, and I'll read right from their letter, that rather than put Mr. Hauck and his family through needless disruption, we will accept a summons on my client's behalf and bring him to you.
Thank you. I'm out of time. The chair recognizes Mr. Nadler for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard examples of violence against anti-abortion clinics. Ms. Camp, What are some examples of violence and disruption that doctors and patients have faced in recent years?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. If I may, I'd like to just review some examples, quite recent examples from 2022. In fact, the first are essentially news reports. And again, every person here, real person, real family, real kids. Michigan 2022, this is from ABC News. Officials said the suspect breached the fence outside the clinic, then used a fuel to ignite bushes surrounding the building before lighting a fireplace starter log that he threw onto the building's roof. California 2022, this is from the FBI. 2 unknown suspects were captured on surveillance video throwing a Molotov cocktail at the front door of a medical building used by Planned Parenthood in Costa Mesa, California. Anthrax letter leaking white powder purported to be anthrax in Ohio in 2022. Inert ricin, according to the FBI, in New Mexico 2022. Texas clinic had all of the wires cut, all the electrical wires going into the clinic cut in 2022. In Michigan, again, in March 2022, a large group of extremists entered the clinic, harassed patients and staff. Additional people outside were shouting through megaphones, making it very hard to provide medical care inside. And in North Carolina, this is quite typical, extremists opened the car doors of patients driving into a clinic parking lot and got into their cars. If helpful, I could read just a couple of the short personal testimonies of folks who have experienced violence in 2022. This is from California in March. We experienced a clinic invasion where a group of anti-abortion protesters posed as a patient. Once our door was open, 3 other extremists rushed in past staff. It was terrifying. You're trying to figure out, are there weapons? What's going to take place here? Is it going to be a speech or is it going to be physical violence? I'll just read one more from Texas. This is Texas. People have guns. There are school shootings. You have that fear because you don't know that that person is just standing there waiting to pull a weapon or if they're standing there just praying for you. Folks providing and accessing abortion care never know. The violence has been so relentless. They just don't know when a gun's going to get pulled.
Thank you for those examples. Let me ask you this. Should Americans, even those who live in states that continue to protect reproductive freedom, should they be concerned that violence, threats, and intimidation against abortion providers could effectively ban abortion access in their states, regardless of what their state law provides?
Absolutely, Congressman. Just as Dobbs left open the door for a nationwide ban on abortion, Dobbs also emboldened anti-abortion extremists to go specifically to clinics and states that protect abortion rights. So NAF's 2022 violence and disruption statistics show a particular increase in those states. So for example, stalkings went up overall 230% in 2022, but they went up 900%, a 900% increase in stalkings at clinics providing abortion care in Haven states. States that protect access to abortion care saw a 130% increase in bomb threats. And directly to your point, Congressman, clinics offering abortion care in states that protect access saw a 540% increase in obstructions. So yes, we all need to fear the effect of violence on people's ability to access this fundamental care.
And finally, my last question, just to be clear as to the stakes, what impact will the total nationwide ban on abortion have on women's reproductive health and well-being?
Congressman, a nationwide ban would be a catastrophe, a public health catastrophe, yes, for people's reproductive health and for public health generally. It would add to the ongoing crisis of lack of access to health care in this country, which absolutely includes lack of access to appropriate high-quality pregnancy-related and labor and delivery care. We have an exceedingly high maternal mortality rate, pregnancy-related death rate, that is, for a wealthy, industrialized country. Let's drive that down, especially for the Black community, which suffers so disproportionately.
And in states which have banned abortion, have we found a higher mortality rate for pregnant women?
I'm not a clinician, and I think it is too soon to tell, but we know internationally, yes, that banning abortion is associated with higher maternal mortality, of course.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield back to the chair.
Thank you for yielding. Ms. Kocher, you just heard testimony from Ms. Camp, and her organization, the National Abortion Federation, recently issued a report that labels crisis pregnancy centers as, quote, fake clinics that use deceptive practices to dissuade people from seeking abortions, unquote. The organization claims that pregnancy resource centers such as yours lie and trick patients and force them to carry unwanted pregnancies to term. How do you respond to the provocative claim by Ms. Camp's organization?
I would say that that's ridiculous. We do not lie to women. We are very clear about the services we provide and what we don't provide. We have four registered nurses on staff. We have professional licensed staff. We are also a licensed adoption agency. We have 8 social workers on staff, and we provide excellent quality health care for women, children, and their families. As a matter of fact, I think it's quite ironic that we are called fake clinics when the abortion clinics themselves in our area do not believe that. We receive referrals from abortion clinics in our area for health services. They refer their patients to us for health services. So why would they do that if we are truly a fake clinic? So I just think it's ridiculous. It's a false narrative that's been created. Any provider, any pregnancy center that provides medical services has licensed registered nurses on staff who are providing those services. They are absolutely bound by their medical license.
I agree with you 100%, and in my law practice many years ago, I represented a number of pregnancy resource centers in my state and others, and I never knew one of them to force any woman to carry a pregnancy to term and give birth. Have you ever forced anyone to carry a pregnancy to term?
We have not, ever.
Despite the valiant efforts of pregnancy resource centers under the Biden administration, as we've noted, the Justice Department has selectively enforced the FACE Act in a manner that caters to the radical pro-abortion movement and fails to adequately protect facilities like yours. After the leak of the Dobbs opinion and overturning of Roe, what kind of threats and violence were directed at you and your pregnancy resource centers? I know you've addressed a little bit of this, but how did the violence and the damage impact the ability of organizations like yours to offer their services?
Sure. So again, we're the 5th center in Minnesota. I'm very well connected with the other pregnancy center directors in our area as well as across the country. And all of the centers that I know are having to increase security, to purchase security cameras, to just take extra cautious measures with everything that we do. For us, our facility that was damaged, the windows are still boarded up because one of the things that we found important is to purchase intrusion-resistant film. And thank God that we had that, because otherwise they would have gotten into our building and they would have done a lot more damage than what was done. And so that's very costly for our building in particular. It was $60,000 to add the film. So in order to fix our windows, not only did we have to order the windows, but we have to have the timing correct to apply the film as well. So every center that I know I have been connecting with, I'm like, you need to get this film on your windows or do bullet-resistant, windows, but it's a real threat.
I know that organizations like yours operate on a very thin margin. You're a nonprofit. You have to raise the funds that you use to serve women, and $60,000 could go a long way in helping women in crisis pregnancies. To your knowledge, have the perpetrators that damaged your pregnancy resource centers been prosecuted under the FACE Act or otherwise held accountable?
No, they have not. We have been in touch with the FBI, but there have been no arrests. Nobody has been identified, to my knowledge.
Yeah, and I want to point out, because it's been mentioned here this morning, the FBI did absolutely nothing with regard to these more than 100 documented attacks on pregnancy resource centers, all the way through until the Republican majority took the House again. We passed a resolution that I authored on the floor, I guess it was in early February, and 6 days after that is when the FBI magically came to this conclusion that they might need to pay attention to some of this, and they offered this supposed reward for information leading to the arrest or prosecution of people involved. But it took them a long, long time to pay attention to that, and it took a resolution of the House of Representatives to force the action. What would you like to see from the Justice Department to make pregnancy resource centers feel safe?
Well, I think the same thing we all want, right? We all want to feel like we can go to work and be safe and that our patients are protected. The same is true for all of us, no matter what side of the aisle you are on. And I think if people are breaking the law and damaging buildings and threatening your safety, they should be prosecuted.
Thank you very much, and I am out of time. Yield back, and the chair recognizes Ms. Scanlon for her 5 minutes. Nope, I'm sorry. Ms. Jackson Lee, apologize. Gentlelady from Texas, recognized.
Mr. Chairman, delighted to welcome you back to the committee you love, and we all love, the Constitutional Committee, and you as chair, and I know that we have an abiding faith and love in the Constitution. Let me acknowledge Mark Hauck, I hope I'm getting it almost right, Jeremy Dice, Tammy Kocher, and Ariel Turco. I just want to acknowledge them because there's nothing that I want to have associated with myself, and I know my colleagues in opposition to the freedom of their positions or the work that their agencies are doing. I represent the Gulf Coast Catholic Diocese in my congressional district. I have had bishops and cardinals in my congressional district, and we have a wonderful working relationship. In actuality, I have had no encounters of the type that we seem to be presenting here. At the same time, I want to thank Ms. Camp for the work of the National Abortion Federation, that all I can see is certainly attempting to do its work. And so my time is brief. I'm going to ask you to be meteoric in your answers, but I must take a moment for my good friend, the chairman, to indicate that the special prosecutor, Mr. Durham, was, I think, appointed by Attorney General Barr. He did have any critique on the actual results of that particular investigation of the FBI and the succeeding special counsel, but commented on the basis upon which the FBI proceeded. Two different things. We wouldn't expect anything from Mr. Durham but to walk in the tracks of who appointed him, and that would be the likes of his work. So we thank him for the service that he gave. Let me just, if you would take just a brief moment to respond to the comment about crisis clinics and anything that your organization would do inappropriately. Did you hear me?
I'm sorry, Congresswoman.
You have a moment to respond very quickly about crisis clinics. Someone said you do something to crisis clinics. Can you just respond? Is that what your organization attacks, crisis clinics?
Absolutely not, Congresswoman.
All right. So that's, I want you to respond that you would be against them, and that is not the case of your work. Is that correct?
Congressman, thank you for the question. We are not against any particular facility. We are in support of providers of abortion care and patients trying to access it. Our 2022 report does note some practices by some of these centers that have delayed and even obstructed care for patients.
And you do it in that context. You do not do it in an attempt to incite anyone to go against these clinics.
Unequivocally not. We just know that patients need unbiased counseling and transparency when they're trying to access services.
And has the FACE Act been a life-saving provision for many of the clinics, freestanding clinics that you are familiar with, dealing with the right to choose and reproductive rights?
Absolutely, Congressman. The FACE Act has been a really important tool. There are so many acts of violence at clinics offering abortion care that so many of the acts of vandalism just don't even get reported, even if they violate FACE, because it's just so frequent. And it requires Herculean efforts on the part of clinic administrators and clinicians.
I have a short period of time, so let me just continue to ask you questions. We know, if I might put into the record, that the FACE Act deals with any activity that blocks access to the interest or obstructs the exit from a facility, trespassing at a clinic, vandalizing reproductive health care facilities, stalking a clinic employee. We know that the bill from Texas that caused the Dobbs Act arose from SB 8, the Texas 6-week ban on abortion, and it had a provision that allowed a civilian to stalk a provider and some woman, some young person that may be a college student, and stalk them and get $10,000. Is that something that is outrageous in terms of denying and threatening someone who is attempting to make a decision with their God, their family, and their provider? And so the FACE Act would keep that kind of activity from occurring. Let me back up so you can answer it, and Chairman will give me just additional seconds, is that historically, do you remember the case in Alabama where the doctor was killed, the nurse was killed, and the bombing of an abortion clinic? That's how far back these abortion bombings go. You can go ahead, please, quickly.
Texas SB 8 was an abomination, a threat to providers of care and those accessing it, and an absolute antithetical to the structure of our republic.
And the FACE Act helps in other places to stop that stalking and threatening.
FACE does make it illegal to stalk and threaten folks providing or accessing abortion care, yes.
I thank you. I yield back.
Thanks, gentlelady. And the chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio for 5 minutes, or the chair of the full committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hauck, why do you think they did it? Why they, I mean, you know, the local police saw this incident. They weren't going to prosecute you. My guess is they probably exercised some common sense and said, you know, this guy's been praying in front of this clinic for 20 years. This guy harassed his son. He did what a dad would do. They chose not to come after you. You volunteered to turn yourself in, and yet they show up at your house, 20 agents, guns drawn, in front of your family, in front of... Why do you think they did it?
Thank you, Congressman Jordan, for the question. I've been thinking about that for many months, and I can only come up with that the intention was to humiliate me, to scare my children, and to instill fear in pro-life America.
Yeah, I think they want to make an example of you, right?
I believe so.
And they told us why they did it. They actually put it in writing. All you got to do is look at the memorandum from the Richmond field office. I mean, you were like front and center. Look at this memorandum. And now, thank goodness they've rescinded it. FBI's rescinded this memorandum. This they call it a domain perspective. I don't know why they can't use just normal terms. It's a memorandum. They rescinded it because a brave whistleblower came and gave us this information. But if you look at page, I think it's page 4, has this sentence: events in which extremists and radical traditional Catholics will remain, events in which extremists and radical traditional Catholics might have common cause include legislation or judicial decisions in areas such as abortion rights, immigration, affirmative action, LGBTQ protections. So if you're pro-family, pro-life, and you want a border, you're a target, and your family fit all of that. Like you're a pro-life, pro-family Catholic, for goodness sake. They're going to come after you. Got 7 kids. You're not allowed to have 7 kids today. You know what? We're trying to save the planet. You can't do that in America today, according to these. They made that you were the example, and that is how pervasive this political attitude is at the highest levels of our agencies. And in this case, it was the FBI, so much so they put together a memo and said, we want to put informants and snitches inside the Catholic Church, inside the parish, to go rat out people like Mark Hauck and his family. Think that's what was going on here?
I would agree with you 100% that my family was targeted, that I've been on a watch list. I am a Novus Ordo Catholic. I'm not a traditional Latin Mass goer, but nonetheless, I embrace our faith and I live it.
They still thought you were radical. They still thought you were radical, right? You may not go to Latin Mass, but they thought you were radical. I mean, local police wouldn't investigate, but we're going after this guy because he's pro-life and he's Catholic and he prays. Man, he's got 7, we're coming after him.
Right. Yeah, my children were downrange of many guns, and they screamed through the whole process. The committee should know that they were traumatized, and I proceeded to be shackled and in front of them and chained to a table for 6 hours in the federal building.
And they were wrong, because you went in front of a jury, and the jury said no, he didn't do anything wrong. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
They prosecuted this case after the local people said, no, we're not going to do it. Federal government says, we're going to make this guy an example. He's an RTC, a radical traditional Catholic, and we're going to come after him. And you did, and you went through the process. God bless you for going through it. But this is what's so scary. And again, we've had a number of whistleblowers come forward and talk about this kind of attitude displayed in this memorandum existing in the Justice Department. And it's as wrong as it gets.
Yeah, I would agree with you. You know, my children, I see it in their face every day. I see it in my wife. Just the fear in their eyes. And certainly they have fear of law enforcement now because the law enforcement guys come after the bad guys, not the good guys.
Yeah,
so my children are confounded by that.
Some guy gets in your kid's face, you do what a dad does. That's scary enough. And then they find out, oh, your dad's going to get prosecuted for standing up and defending his son. It's wrong, and everyone knows it's wrong, and it needs to stop. And frankly, as I said in my opening statement, I think the only way we can actually begin to stop this is we got to do what legislatures do. You got to look at the money. You got to look at the money. You got to say, look, if an FBI is going to do this kind of stuff to good people like you and your family, they may not be getting the funds that they've got before, and they certainly won't be using funds in certain ways. That's something we have to do. We have an obligation, a constitutional duty to do that, and I know Chairman Johnson is going to be working on that with us to try to make that happen. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and many thanks to our witnesses for being here today. I think it's really important for women in America to understand what's happening here. This is yet another example of how one of our parties in the two-party system, the Republican Party, is hell-bent on making sure that women do not have access to reproductive health care and cannot make decisions about their own futures. This is just yet another example of the messaging and the efforts to try to control women. And let me remind everyone again the difference between the two sides. Our side believes that we've got to take care of families and that we've got to make sure that children have a good future. And we did that by voting for paid family and medical leave. We voted for the expanded child tax credit. We voted for universal pre-K. We voted for affordable child care. All of this was just last Congress. And to a person, my Republican colleagues voted against all of that. So let's lift end the charade. And in fact, right now, part of the negotiations that are ongoing, both on the Farm Bill and in appropriations, as well as in the efforts for my Republican colleagues to default on our debt, involves taking SNAP away from families, in other words, taking food away from the mouths of children. But as part, if they can't limit women legislatively, they will bully and threaten those providers who help women and the women who use services. In fact, last year, because of the, and let me be clear, I don't believe anyone should be engaging in any violence or intimidation. All of us should reject all of that. But we're here really because we're chasing another conspiracy theory that is being put out there by my Republican colleagues. Last Congress, and again this January, I introduced the Healthcare Providers Safety Act, which would amend the Public Health Service Act to authorize grants to healthcare providers to enhance the physical and cybersecurity of their facilities, personnel, and patients. This bill would give providers the needed resources to ensure patients and providers are safe and able to continue providing and receiving this essential reproductive health care. I'd like to ask Ms. Camp a question. Ms. Camp, in your view, has the FACE Act been effective in helping to mitigate some of the violence, threats, and intimidation faced by abortion providers and patients? Do you think that the FACE Act, FACE Act enforcement to protect abortion providers and patients could be stronger?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Yes and yes, FACE has been an important tool in addressing the relentless violence, including murders and death threats against those who provide and access abortion care. But absolutely, as I said before, I mean, this violence is just relentless. It's so run-of-the-mill. Plenty of things that violate FACE our members just simply don't report because it's so run-of-the-mill for them.
It really has become run-of-the-mill. I met with a provider in Texas, one of the last few before Texas passed its historic and awful ban in our state. Who talked to me about how routine the threats and the intimidation had gotten. I spoke with a mother who had to undergo an abortion because the fetus was not going to survive and it threatened her life and would render her existing children motherless. She had to face intimidation as she walked into the clinic to receive care. And I'm running out of time, but I would just say that we need more programs to combat the kind of harassment and intimidation and violence that far too many clinicians and patients are seeing across America. Thank you for your testimony today. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hauck, I just want to see if we can sum up. It sounds like the facts out of which your prosecution by DOJ arose involved a squabble between activists. That part is correct, right?
I would agree with that.
Okay, and there was one shove that led to somebody falling down, correct?
Correct.
And that was preceded by provocation and profanity focused on your child, correct?
At other times, not particularly on that day of the incident, but yes.
Okay. And didn't you say that the activist was engaging with your child right before you escorted him back and then you had the shove?
Yes, I did say that.
Okay. And then authorities decided to indict you under the FACE Act, right?
Correct.
Do I understand from the other testimony that there's a civil provision of the FACE Act? Somebody could have sued if they wanted to? Do you know that?
I don't know about that. I can't answer that.
I think that, I believe that's what I heard, but nobody sued. They decided to indict you. They didn't indict you for a misdemeanor charge, which is like a 1 year term. They indicted you for a felony, right?
That's correct. 2 counts.
2 counts, 1 felony, maybe 1 misdemeanor. I think it was totally 11 years imprisonment they saw
That's correct, Congressman.
out of this squabble. And then they ignored your offer to surrender. Instead, they used a SWAT team to take you down, right?
That's right.
And then they proceed to a jury trial. And the only thing that stopped you from going to prison for 11 years is that a jury of Americans acquitted you in the face of that, correct?
Unanimously, yes, correct.
And so that strikes me as that's a data point. Now, I understand my colleagues on the other side who say, well, this is, sort of pass this away or say people are shadow boxing here, but that seems to me a data point that is this confounding. And Ms. Camp, I want to go to you. As described, does that seem like a disproportionate exercise of prosecutorial judgment to you?
So thank you for the question, Congressman.
Real quick, because I don't have much time.
I am not a prosecutor. I'm not.
You don't know? Let me ask you this. You spoke to, I think, an arson attack on an abortion facility or something in Texas. Did you talk about that during your testimony, your answers?
I think it wasn't in Texas, but yes, arsons,
Okay.
yes.
Did somebody get prosecuted for that? Because they damn well should have been.
I agree, Congressman.
Were they?
I believe not yet, but there's definitely a shortage of resources to prosecute.
Do you have any insight why they would prosecute Mr. Hauck for a squabble with an activist outside and send the SWAT team and take him to a jury that acquits him if they haven't gotten the person who committed an arson attack on a clinic, on an abortion clinic? Any insight at all?
Congressman, I'm not with the DOJ. I don't have that information.
Well, does anybody on the panel have any insight about why they would do that? See, I think that's the thing that's concerning. And then you hear
Would
about...
the gentleman yield? I do have some insight
Do you have an
on that.
answer, a quick answer? Yield for an answer to that, real quick.
Sure, Mr. Hauck was a well-known aggressive participant in demonstrations outside facilities in Philadelphia.
So they picked him.
He did not just push the guy once. 72-year-old man, he admitted he pushed him down.
It's my time, and
twice. Oh, sorry, you asked for
No, I was
input
giving
from
you the answer.
panel.
You gave me the answer. You gave me the answer a minute ago. Mr. Hauck was an activist. He was opposed to the killing of children through abortion, and he said that, so they made him a target. Let me tell you what that is. That is called selective prosecution in violation of the Constitution. You cannot make prosecutorial decisions because you want to make an example out of somebody who's a well-known anti-abortion or pro-life activist. You can't do that. That's unconstitutional. If that is the answer to the question that I posed to Ms. Camp, then it deepens the concern about the Justice Department and the FBI. If that is the answer, then it indicates that we have, as the Durham, Mr. Nadler denigrates the Durham report. Ms. Jackson Lee says, well, Durham, the special counsel, came to his conclusions just because of who appointed him. No, we see institutional corruption. Despite for the First Amendment rights of Americans, which is expressed through politicized prosecutorial activity, is the most grievous crisis that I've ever seen in this country. I cannot believe that I have to be concerned about the FBI and the DOJ, and then, frankly, members of Congress sitting up here and say, I have the explanation. We picked Mr. Hauck because he's a zealous advocate for
Would the
life.
gentleman yield? That's not what I said.
That's exactly what you said.
it is
and
not.
I think that's the answer that most Americans have regrettably come to the conclusion that that's what's happened. My time's expired.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. The Bull Durham report was released yesterday, and Trump has promised us that to look forward to that Bull Durham report, and when it came out, it would prove that the Russia investigation was a witch hunt. But unfortunately, the Bull Durham report yesterday amounts to a crock of BS. 2 prosecutions, 2 acquittals. And we know how rare acquittals are in the federal system. He's batting 0. No conclusion that Trump was the victim of a witch hunt. A 4-year investigation that petered out as a waste of time and taxpayers' money. That is the legacy of the Bull Durham report. Now, Mrs. Turco, your testimony is that between January of 2018 and September of 2022, there have been over 420 acts of hostility against pro-life pregnancy centers. Is that correct?
No, that was against churches.
Against churches, not against pro-life pregnancy centers? Is that right?
Yes, because my report was focused on churches. I did, however,
Are we here conflating hostility, acts of hostility against churches, to acts of violence against these pregnancy centers that you all talk about? Is that what we're conflating today?
no, these are both covered in the FACE Act.
What relevance does acts of hostility against churches have when it comes to the assertions on this committee that there have been acts of violence against these so-called pro-life pregnancy centers?
Churches and houses of worship are also covered in the FACE Act,
Okay, but
as well as abortion
we're
clinics.
here today talking about pro-life pregnancy centers, not churches. And you were brought here to talk about churches, and maybe you were brought here to confuse the public. But the confusion is, we're not going to go for that. We're not going to have that. And by the way, as far as the acts of hostility against churches, did you note any acts of murder?
No, these were
Any acts
against...
of bombings?
Yes.
Bombings?
Bomb threats and...
Bomb threat,
Yes.
but no actual bombings.
This year in the supplemental report that
no
covers
acts of
January through
bombings, right?
there was a pipe bomb incident.
But no bombing, correct?
I guess not.
Okay, and no acts of physical assault against anybody. All of these things that you're talking about, these 420 acts occurred at churches. And of those, looks like of the 420, looks like only 62 of them were abortion related. Is that correct?
57 from January 2018 to
57
September
of the
2022.
420 were abortion related. So, ma'am, I abhor violence against anyone and anything. And but my point is that perhaps your testimony would have been good for another hearing, not not this hearing.
Would the gentleman yield for just a moment?
Yes.
So the title of our hearing, just for clarification, is Revisiting the Implications of the FACE Act, which specifically
Yes,
covers
I recognize that. but
exercising
you,
the First Amendment right of religious freedom in
reclaiming
place
my
of religious
time,
worship.
Reclaiming my time, the tone and thrust of this hearing has been towards what is alleged to have been violence directed at these so-called pro-life pregnancy centers. But the fact is, the case has not been made that there have been acts of violence against these centers. But on the other hand, there has been a need for the FACE Act because in the last 50 years, anti-abortion extremists have committed 11 murders, 42 bombings, over 500 incidents of assault and battery. And post-Dobbs, the threats and the violence are escalating.
The gentleman's out of time.
Okay, all right.
And I believe you had a scheduled conflict and walked in a little bit late today, but I just point out that Ms. Del Turco's report also includes reports of at least 57 pro-abortion acts of hostility against churches between January 22 and September 2022, and that this extends to pregnancy centers as well. It's all related. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy. 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Hauck, after your family was raided in the early morning in front of your family, has the Biden administration in any way, shape, or form apologized for what they did to you or your family?
No, Congressman.
No apology?
No.
None. And as we've heard today, you are specifically targeted because you're an activist, you're a pro-life activist.
Correct.
Question for Ms. Camp. Earlier, you mentioned in your reports, you were quoting articles in which the FBI made statements about attacks on abortion clinics. How many statements by the FBI have there been on attacks on crisis pregnancy centers?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I don't have that information.
Right, because I'm not aware of there being any. What percentage of abortion-related violence cases or cases of violence or threats are threats against pro-life organizations?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
What percentage of abortion-related violence cases or cases are cases of violence or threats against pro-life organizations? The answer is 70%, according to FBI Director Wray, that well-known, pro-life activist. 70%, according to FBI Director Wray. Another question. You serve as the Chief Legal and Strategy Officer at the National Abortion Federation, correct?
Yes.
In this role, have you ever spoken with anyone in the Biden Department of Justice or Biden administration specifically about FACE Act enforcement or abortion?
I have not.
Okay, so you as the Chief Legal and Strategy Officer for the National Abortion Federation, you have had no contact with President Biden's abortion task force.
Let me be accurate. I believe I may have had contact, I don't think so, but I may have, but on the issue of FACE enforcement, no, I have not.
Okay, in 2015, the Center for Medical Progress released a video in which you stated, quote, "I'm like, oh my God, I get it. When the skull is broken, that's really sharp. I get it. I understand why people are talking about getting that skull out, that culvarium. Culvarium being an incomplete skull. When abortion has crushed the skulls of babies to kill them, what physical risks are there for the baby?"
So, Congressman, thank you for the question. It allows me to clarify that the media products you're referring to stoked a massive uptick in violence. Those heavily edited, misleadingly edited media products caused 3 murders and 9 woundings in Colorado Springs in 2015.
The question was about the baby and the skull crushing that is, I think, a direct quote attributed to you.
Well, the folks who distributed those media products may have attributed something to me. I can't speak to.
So, true or false, did you say that? I'm like, oh my God, I get it. When the skull is broken, that's really sharp. Did you say that?
It's impossible to know, Congressman.
Would you have said that? Is that something you would have said?
I don't know, Congressman.
You don't know. You don't know if you talked about the crushing of the skull of a baby. You don't remember having said something like that.
What I do-
I'm pretty confident I've never said something like that. I'm quite confident my colleagues here have never said something like that. Have you ever said something about crushing the skull of the baby, particularly in that kind of a setup?
I believe, Congressman, that we all came here today to agree that violence is never an appropriate response to policy differences.
That seems pretty violent, the crushing of the skull of a baby. I think that actually is the definition of violence. And I think the question here is whether or not we are going to acknowledge and recognize that reality, and the extent to which now the federal government has been weaponized against the people who want to acknowledge that reality. That's the question. Mr. Hauck has stood up and said, I'd like to recognize the reality of the violence against a baby. And by the way, the violence against the mother who's been sold a myth by radical leftists in the name of baby killing. They've been sold a myth that it is somehow healthy and good for them or better than for them. And if someone dares stands up like Mr. Hauck, then he's been targeted, as my colleague acknowledged from this very dais, targeted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which we saw was weaponized specifically against the President of the United States, as we just saw in the Durham report, is weaponized against average citizens. Mr. Hauck, do you think $38.5 billion is sufficient funds for the Department of Justice? Or do you think maybe it's too many funds if they're carrying out actions against people like you?
I would think it's too many funds.
I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now yields to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A lot of discussion's been on the Durham report this morning. People have commented on it. The weaponization of the Justice Department, the FBI. The same FBI that issued the incorrect and inappropriate and extraordinary statement about Hillary Clinton in the last 10 days of the 2016 election, that the Trump and the Clinton people agreed was the cause of Donald Trump winning what was otherwise an election that she would have won. So if you want to talk about the FBI being weaponized, what Christopher Wray did in releasing this, what Comey did in the last few days, the last 10 days or so, about Hillary Clinton and the questions about her caused the election to be switched. I mean, there's no weaponization. What we've got is a weaponization of the political system to destroy a woman's choice, women's right to choice. I was in law school when Roe was passed. Roe was the law for almost 50 years. It was established law. And we had 3 justices that were put on the Supreme Court because of the Federalist Society that went to Donald Trump, a man who had been pro-choice and proclaimed his idea of being pro-choice on some radio show, some shock jock guy in New York, but was susceptible to influence. And when the Federalist Society came to him and said, we'll help you get the evangelical vote if you will appoint folks that we recommend to you for the Supreme Court. And Trump did it. One of the most controversial decisions that people have, differences of opinion in this country. I'm pro-choice. I respect the people who are pro-choice, and I respect people who are pro-life. Each group has a position that they're wedded to because of their philosophy, their morality, or whatever. Trump had none of that. It was all about being president, and he gave up his position, which he earlier had, to become president. And they gave him Gorsuch, and they gave him Kavanaugh, and they gave him Barrett. And all of them in their hearings said they believed in precedent, established precedent in the dealings with Roe v. Wade. And then they got on the court, and they all changed their positions, decided to be activist judges and to eradicate Roe v. Wade. They got on the court through some very unusual, and I would say should be illegal, but was permissive, actions of the Senate. First, you had a vacancy in Barack Obama's last term, 11 months before he finished it, and Senator McConnell said you shouldn't appoint anybody in the last year of a term. So we're not going to even give a hearing to Merrick Garland, who was President Obama's nominee. I think that's the first time, or one of the very few times at least, but I thought the first time that a president had not been allowed to have a hearing, at least, on a nominee for the Supreme Court 11 months into his last year of his first term, or at any time. But they did. They stopped him because, oh no, you can't put anybody on in your last year. You let the voters decide at the election. But when a vacancy came up within a month or two of the election of Donald Trump, it was all okay to get Amy Coney Barrett put through, I think, about 3 weeks before the election. So hypocrisy, maybe, maybe just lying to the public and saying nobody should be appointed in the last year because they did it with Barrett. And that's how we got a couple of our appointees, Mr. Gorsuch and Ms. Barrett, and then Mr. Kavanaugh. Of course, the FBI did not follow through on all the questions about his alleged assaults, and they didn't do a complete investigation on his alleged assaults and the particular lady that testified against him. So they weren't weaponized against the Republicans or weaponized against anything. In fact, their lack of action resulted in Kavanaugh being nominated and approved. Those three judges, Kavanaugh, who had a weak to non-existent investigation of sexual assault allegations, Gorsuch, who got on because they said you shouldn't put anybody on in the last year, and Barrett, who got on despite that fact, resulted in the repealing of Roe v. Wade. What we've had is a failure of the legislative process, a failure of the Constitution, and while within the parameters of legality, an abrupt act against the Constitution and what it suggests for president nominees to the Supreme Court. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Camp, are you familiar with the FBI's use of DVE, or domestic violent extremism threat tags?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Can you say that again?
Yes. Are you familiar with the FBI's use of DVE, or domestic violent extremism threat tags?
I am not.
Okay. Ms. Camp, can you point to even one situation where the Department of Justice or FBI treated a pro-abortion protester, arsonist, vandalizer, rioter, or attacker similar to how they treated Mr. Hauck?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I want to say that I oppose violence and all.
I didn't ask that question. Can you point to even one circumstance where a pro-abortion attacker, protester, arsonist, vandalizer, or rioter were treated by the DOJ or FBI similar to how they treated Mr. Hauck?
Well, I want to be responsive, but I want to reiterate that the National Abortion...
Do you know of even one person?
Ma'am, the National Abortion Federation is a professional organization of abortion providers. We track violence against those who provide and access abortion care. We don't track other kinds of violence.
So you can't point to even one incident where a pro-abortion protester, arsonist, vandalizer, or rioter was treated similar to how the DOJ and the FBI treated Mr. Hauck. Can you? Is that your testimony?
Well, what I can tell you is that when the DOJ put out a reward for information on 10 different incidents, 9 of them were at anti-abortion.
Did they raid anyone's home and arrest someone in front of their 7 children with guns drawn?
Well, no, they're just looking for information.
Okay, that's what I thought. Mr. Dies, I want to thank you for being here today, and your testimony is important as someone who has firsthand experience working with the victims of these heinous crimes that have been described. Mr. Dies, are you familiar with the committee's investigative work and findings about the DOJ and FBI's weaponizing domestic extremism threat tags and statutes against Americans' constitutionally protected rights?
Not beyond what you've revealed this morning.
Okay, but you have represented clients whose clinics, employees, or patients have been subjected to vandalism and violence from pro-abortion groups, haven't you?
Yes, ma'am.
How do you respond to the reality of a DOJ which is labeling parents using constitutionally protected speech as domestic violence extremists, or padding crime stats to falsify the record about a rise in domestic extremism, but does little to nothing about politically motivated attacks on your clients, which could actually qualify as domestic extremism.
It's certainly disconcerting, and I think that exemplifies precisely why the FACE Act is important, because when we have a situation where speech reaches a tipping point into violence, that's where we find ourselves at with these situations, where we characterize speech as violence instead of violence as violence. Violence has no place in our political dialogue, and certainly we should not express our political disagreements with a brick or a crowbar through a window. That's what our clients have had to endure, along with many other instances like that, and yet there's only been the single indictment with 4 people indicted under that in response to the 100+ attacks in the past year.
Well, then I was just going to get to that. As you mentioned in your testimony, the Department of Justice has returned just 1 indictment in response to the over 100 acts of intimidation, injury, and interference towards those seeking service from pro-life organizations in the past year. Yet even before the Dobbs decision, the DOJ announced the standing up of an abortion rights task force. So not only is the DOJ on the one hand infringing on protected rights connected to peaceful actions, it is not enforcing the law when violations are targeted at the same political groups that the DOJ itself has been targeting. It is instead prioritizing the protection of law based on its preferred political narrative, which in this case is the pro-abortion movement. Are you aware of any task forces, memos, or priorities being set by the DOJ which would also focus attention to protecting pro-life and religious facilities under the FACE Act or any of its other authorities?
I am not, but my clients would welcome that.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. As I stated at the outset, violence and threats have no place in American political discourse, no matter what the cause or who the target. And when leaders advocate for such violence or selectively condemn it for political gain, they normalize such violence and undermine our democracy. Congress has an important role to play in protecting and defending our democracy from the corrosive impact of political violence. Those who study this issue recommend that we can make sure that anyone who promotes, condones, or turns a blind eye to political violence is held accountable, whether the former President of the United States to members of Congress to those who actually commit such threats or acts of violence, no matter what their political objective. But more importantly, members of Congress can make sure that they take steps to prevent the normalization of political violence by refraining from using violent images and rhetoric and condemning it, no matter the source. By convening a hearing that inflames grievances and amplifies misinformation concerning the prevalence of violence against anti-abortion forces, this hearing does not advance our congressional duty to protect and preserve our democracy from the corrosive forces of political disinformation and violence. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle continue to push a false narrative that the federal government is out to get them, but the facts are not on their side. In fact, they don't have the evidence or the public support for their policies or narrative. The clear majority of Americans believe we must protect access to abortion care and the freedom to make reproductive health care decisions in consultation with one's doctor, not politicians. Ms. Camp, obviously political vandalism and threats are unacceptable no matter to whom they are directed. At today's hearing, the majority has cited anecdotal evidence concerning vandalism at anti-abortion facilities while refusing to acknowledge the far more pervasive and longstanding threats and violence directed at providers and facilities that offer reproductive health care, including abortion care. And you've produced a report detailing the level of violence against facilities that provide such care over a period of years. Can you explain how instances of violence, threats, and intimidation that you've documented impact abortion access, even in states like Pennsylvania, where abortion access remains legally protected?
Sure. Well, as we discussed previously, it is in states that have protected access to abortion care that we've seen a really pronounced uptick in violence in the last year, sort of over 500% increase in obstructions, 130% increase in bomb threats, a 900% increase in stalkings. And so the terror that people suffer under in providing this fundamental health care, holds true across the country. I'd also say that, the stalking of patients and taking pictures of them and their license plates using, sort of location data to try to determine their activities is really terrifying for patients. And we see that illustrated just this past weekend in the tragic murder of Gabriela Gonzalez by her boyfriend after she had to travel out of Texas for abortion care. Folks legitimately fear that if they can't keep their abortion decision confidential, they'll be killed, leaving their existing children orphaned. And so the need for people now to travel hundreds of miles or even more to access abortion care makes it that much harder to maintain their confidentiality. So folks are really scared.
Can you speak to the danger of using misleading or inflammatory language where political violence is already a threat to healthcare providers providing abortion care?
Sure, thank you, Congresswoman. Yeah, we know that inflammatory rhetoric creates upticks in violence, threats of violence, all of these major incidents. And the selective sort of outrage just normalizes violence against folks providing and therefore accessing abortion care. Inflammatory rhetoric, I think, is really antithetical to the goal I would think of all of us here at this hearing today, which is to ratchet down violence.
Thank you. We heard testimony about mounting public criticism of pregnancy crisis centers. Therefore, I'd seek unanimous consent to introduce a report by the Alliance entitled Designed to Deceive, a study of the crisis pregnancy center industry in 9 states.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Fry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing today. Radical Democrats have attempted all day to downplay, cover up, and ignore the reality that crisis pregnancy centers and churches are under attack. I guess their approach is not surprising. In my brief time in Congress, every single hearing that we have had, we hear the same narrative, that Republicans hearing today about blank is a fantasy, that it is a conspiracy theory. Well, 100 instances in the last couple years is not a fantasy. It is not a conspiracy theory. They have told us that the border is secure, of course. They have failed to acknowledge and indeed sneer at the weaponization of our federal government against its own citizens, despite most recently the Durham report that was dropped yesterday. They failed to condemn labeling parents as domestic terrorists for just speaking out at their school board meeting. The Democrats' own witness today, Ms. Camp, said that every administration has enforced the FACE Act, Republican and Democrat alike. The only caveat that I will say to that, the only asterisk that I would provide is, except this one. With over 100 attacks, threats, arson, spray painting, it is very clear that this administration has no intention of enforcing the laws unless it has a political benefit to them. You look at, and the chairman talked about this earlier, look at the dichotomy that we have here. On one hand, we have Mr. Hauck, right? We have Eva Edel from Aiken, South Carolina, an 87-year-old lady who survived a communist concentration camp in Yugoslavia. She comes to America, and her egregious crime is singing hymns in a hallway. And over 2 years later, about 2 years later, she's charged with a federal crime with the full weight of the federal government. And we fast forward here to these instances that we outlined that are now in the record. Mother's Day last year, suspects reportedly threw 2 Molotov cocktails into an Oregon Right to Life office. On June 27, 2022, 2 Molotov cocktails thrown into 2 Hearts Pregnancy Center in Everett, Washington. June 30th of 2022, a Molotov cocktail was thrown into the Hope Clinic for Women in Nashville. Federal law enforcement did investigate the crime as attempted arson and vandalism, but not the FACE Act. Molotov cocktails are thrown repeatedly. Arsons happen repeatedly. The defacing of property, the vandalism of property, the threats against people and property happen repeatedly. Mr. Dice, can you describe what the FACE Act is supposed to protect?
Well, the FACE Act clearly defines what it's supposed to protect by saying that any service relating to the human reproductive system is protected by the FACE Act.
Right, so the intention of Congress at the time was that not only that they would do this for abortion providers, but also crisis pregnancy centers, churches, things like that on both sides of this equation, right? This is kind of what the intent of the law was supposed to be.
Yeah, the FACE Act knows no ideology. It simply seeks to protect reproductive health centers, facilities, as well as, it should be pointed out, houses of worship.
Right, but we're not seeing that right now. We're not seeing that right now with the prosecution of these 100 instances of violence against crisis pregnancy centers and churches.
Yeah, in the past year, we've seen over 100 of those instances, and yet only a single indictment in the Middle District of Florida.
Ms. Camp, you stated in your written and oral testimony that, quote, no one should fear violence at the workplace or when seeking health care. Given these attacks on crisis pregnancy centers and churches, would you agree that they should be entitled to the full protection of the law?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. So I want to make clear I condemn all acts of violence and intimidation.
Well, that's great, and I appreciate that. But are they entitled to the full protection of the law?
Any entity facing actual, real, serious threats of harm should have protection.
Right, so Molotov cocktails, right? Those would be entitled to protection under the law.
Well, throwing a Molotov cocktail at a reproductive health facility would be a face violation, yes, but I'm not in a position as, representative of a professional organization of abortion providers to speak to what's happening at other kinds of entities. I just don't have that knowledge.
Well, you don't have the knowledge, but you would agree with me that they are entitled to protection, and they are entitled to the zealous protection under the law by the DOJ, by the FBI, in routing out and identifying the people who commit these acts of violence. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, DOJ should protect all of us from violence, whether we're abortion providers or patients or others.
So in that case, do you find it troubling, like in the case of Ms. Kocher here, do you find it troubling that she has not received a fair adjudication of that violence against her facility?
Congressman, as I think I've said before, I'm just not with the DOJ. I believe there are complex...
And I'm not asking that. What I'm asking, though, is do you think, in her case, in her testimony today, there's been extremism lobbed at her, and extremism lobbed at her employees and the property in which she has. Do you think that that's troubling that years later, that she has not received really any help from the DOJ?
So, Congressman, I can give you two answers. One is, I condemn acts of violence regardless of whom they target. And the other is, I can tell you that acts of violence, intimidation, stalking, threats, murders at providers of abortion, targeting providers of abortion care, are terribly addressed. And so I am not in a position, that I can tell you, but I cannot speak to the various decisions DOJ makes. I would think DOJ could.
Before I yield back, just briefly, I just find it really troubling that you talk about these acts of violence against your facilities, but when she's sitting right next to you, she just testified to this. This isn't an obscure theory in law that we're talking about or a fact pattern. This happened. And so I'm a little bit surprised that you would not encourage the Biden Department of Justice and FBI to prosecute these cases. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's out of time. Ms. Camp, did you want to respond to that?
No, thank you, sir.
Okay. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hunt. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing here today. I really appreciate it. For the record, I am pro-life, and I thank God that my mom was also pro-life, because if not for her, I wouldn't be sitting before you as a congressman today. Since this past Sunday was Mother's Day, I want to thank my mother for choosing life. Good looking out, Mom. If you're a member of the pro-life movement, you will be targeted. If you're a pro-choice protester, you will be protected. And this is how the Biden administration puts their thumbs on the scales of justice. What we're really talking about here today is a selective application and enforcement of federal law. And I've brought some receipts. Under this administration, conservatives are being targeted. Our first example is the ATF. The ATF has targeted lawful gun owners by crafting a rule that would make 40 million Americans felons overnight. Of course, there's the FBI. The FBI conducted an unprecedented raid at President Trump's home at Mar-a-Lago. They used FISA research warrants against conservatives. They've attempted to put moles in churches to spy on radical Christians. And of course, we have the recent results of this Durham report. And of course, we cannot forget about the CIA. Just this last week, this committee published this report that former intelligence officials colluded with the Biden campaign to discredit the Hunter Biden laptop. This happened just days before the 2020 election. I say to that, well, hot damn, that sounds like election interference to me. They call this Russian disinformation. But that doesn't look like disinformation to me. This looks like Hunter Biden committing a felony. Now, we've heard a lot of talk on this committee about crime guns, and I would call this a Biden crime gun. The day after this report was released, there was no mention of this in mainstream publications. What did they talk about? George Santos. George Santos. Conveniently, George Santos was indicted the day this report was released. Coincidence? Well, you decide. But unfortunately for Democrats, there's only one George Santos to keep the Biden family off the front page of the Washington Post, so buckle up. This is Hunter Biden's gun application. I would like to direct your attention to question 11 Echo. It says, are you an unlawful user of or addicted to marijuana or any depressant, stimulant, narcotic drug, or any other controlled substance? Now, in the words of the late, great, notorious B.I.G., when referring to the only way is to get out of the hood, he famously said, either you're slinging crack rock or you got a wicked jump shot. Now, Hunter Biden does not have a wicked jump shot, but he definitely slings crack rock. Out of respect for the president, I'm not going to show any photos of Hunter with prostitutes and grams of crack, but we all know he has a checkered past. Hunter Biden lied on this application about his history of illegal drug use. He obtained a gun anyway and was never prosecuted. If we saw this behavior from Donald Trump Jr., he would have been in handcuffs a long time ago. But the bottom line is this: the ATF is focused on making 40 million law-abiding citizens felons when they should be worried about Hunter Biden lying on a gun application, which is a felony, by the way. There's no wonder why the American people have lost faith and trust in the federal government. If you want to restore trust, stop spying on Americans. Stop targeting conservatives and pro-life people, and apply the law equally. And to the FBI, the CIA, the ATF, please put Hunter Biden in jail. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and Ms. Scanlon and I, the ranking member and I, are going to do one more quick round of questions just to put a bow on this, and I'll recognize myself for that 5 minutes. And I just had a question for Ms. Camp, or a couple of questions. You're the Chief Legal and Strategy Officer for the National Abortion Federation. Before that, you spent 20 years at the ACLU, and I think you were in charge of their Reproductive Freedom Project, right?
I was not the director, I was the deputy director.
Deputy director, okay. Just for the record, because we've talked a lot about violence here today, and violence, I think in your words, you said you track violence against people providing abortion services, but I've not heard you acknowledge at all the brutal violence committed against children in the womb, as Mr. Roy was asking, when their skulls are crushed and when their limbs are ripped apart to kill and abort them. I want to know for the record, are there any restrictions at all on abortion that you would support?
So thank you for the question, Congressman. The question you ask is one of profound moral dimension, one that only the person who's pregnant can answer in consultation with their own soul, their pastor, their God, their doctor, their spouse, their nurse. That's where the moral authority rests to answer the question you've asked.
So you have no position on, for example, would you support restrictions on sex selection abortions when someone chooses to abort a child just because of the sex?
So, Congressman, I can only reiterate, the person with the moral authority to make a decision about a pregnancy is the pregnant person.
Understood that, but on this specific issue, would you or your organization support a legal restriction on sex selection abortion?
My organization supports abortion providers in providing patient-centered, evidence-based care, the care that the pregnant person decides is necessary.
Okay, then if that person decides to have an abortion after 20 weeks gestation, do you support that?
So Congressman?
It's a yes or no question. I understand the morality and the complexity, but do you support an abortion after 20 weeks gestation, yes or no?
Respectfully, Congressman, it's not a yes or no question. What I support is providers being able to offer the care that patients know they need.
And you support that in a case of an unborn child that's after 20 weeks gestation, correct?
I support it in situations where the patient has decided in
Do
counsel.
you oppose parental consent laws before a teenager can obtain an abortion?
So I have to say, Congressman, these questions sound really far afield from the reason
No, ma'am,
thought
wait a minute, hold on. You're the Chief Legal and Strategy Officer for the National Abortion Federation. You are the perfect person to answer these questions.
But,
It's not a field. Everything's on the table, ma'am, for a hearing. And you came here purporting to be an expert in the field, and I'm asking you a very simple question and an important one.
Sure, I just want to point out that I think we're here, all of us together, to oppose violence at reproductive health care facilities.
We are talking about violence to the unborn child now, directly related to the issue at hand. And I want to know, do you oppose parental consent laws before a teenager can obtain an abortion?
So, you know, the issue of minors' access is complicated. I do not think that, we all know that the vast majority of minors do involve at least one parent in their decision. Lawmakers coercing certain family dynamics is not helpful, is not.
Is a parental consent law an example of a lawmaker coercing a decision?
Sure. Well, we know from multiple cases that when minors don't involve a parent, it's with very good reason.
Okay.
So,
Earlier, Mr. Roy was asking you about the crushing of the skull of an unborn child. You acknowledge that that is part of an abortion procedure if it's a later term pregnancy, correct?
I don't think I did do that. I'm not a clinician.
Ma'am, you're in charge of the National Abortion Federation. You know that they crush the skulls of unborn children. Come on. You're under oath. You're under oath. Is that true or not?
I completely understand I'm under oath, Congressman, and I am trying to be accurate.
Is that a part of the abortion procedure for a late-term abortion? Yes or no? Crushing the skull?
Well, I don't.
No, ma'am, it's a yes or no question. Is that part of it? Yes or no? Under oath, you're under oath. Is that a part of the procedure?
I understand I'm under oath, and what I can tell you is that my background is in law and strategy,
How
not
convenient.
medicine.
Ma'am, if it were true that they crushed the skull of an unborn child to take the baby out and complete the abortion, would that be an act of violence to you?
Congressman, the violence I see is the violence of forced abortion and forced birth.
All right. I think your non-responses here speak volumes for the record, and I yield back. I recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank all of our witnesses for coming today. I appreciate your insights on what we need to do across the country to combat violence, whether it's pro-abortion or anti-abortion or just pro-healthcare. There's certainly work to be done, and Congress should do that work. Ms. Camp, the National Abortion Federation's report on 2022 violence and disruption notes that post-Dobbs, anti-abortion activists shifted their focus to states like Pennsylvania, where abortion remains legal and protected, and that as a result, protective states saw a disproportionate increase in violence and disruption against abortion providers and patients. Can you elaborate on those findings?
Sure. So thank you for the question, Congresswoman. What we know is that the Dobbs decision and the proliferation of abortion bans throughout the state, bans that mandate pregnancy and childbirth against the will of pregnant folks, those events emboldened anti-abortion extremists so that we saw a concentration of those extremist tactics at clinics continuing to offer abortion care in states that protect access to abortion care. So that, whereas for stalking, we saw an overall increase in stalking from 2021 to 2022 of 230%, but in states that protect access to abortion care, the increase was 900%, a 900% increase in stalking of providers and patients. In states protecting access to this fundamental health care, a 130% increase in bomb threats. And in those states that are protecting access to this fundamental care, a 540% increase in obstructions, the core FACE violations.
And am I correct that in the areas where you saw a reduction in threats and obstructions and other harassment of patients in facilities, that can be attributed in part to the fact that in many states with these post-Dobbs ruling, many of the clinics which regularly report issues to you have in fact closed and are no longer reporting?
That's absolutely right, Congresswoman. So many of our member clinics have had to close because of bans on abortion care, bans that force people to remain pregnant and give birth against their will. Many of our member clinics have closed. Of those that closed, many had reported numerous voluminous instances of extremist violence, but they weren't open to report it to us at the time we collected the 2022 statistics.
Okay. We've seen some anecdotal reports referenced here. There doesn't appear to have been an actual study by a credible source concerning the incidence of violence and threats regarding anti-abortion facilities. Would you agree, though, that the bulk of violence, threats, and intimidation related to the provision or obtaining of reproductive health services, including post-Dobbs, have been directed against abortion providers and patients?
Unequivocally, unquestionably, Congresswoman, the vast majority of bombings, arsons, stalkings, threats, harassment, death threats have been against providers of abortion care and folks seeking to access that care as patients.
Thank you. I have no further questions. I yield back.
And this concludes today's hearing. We thank the witnesses for appearing before the committee today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.